All right, so think about like the last few things you actually bought.
Right.
You probably, I don't know, maybe tapped your debit card to get a coffee,
Oh, yeah.
or paid your internet bill online through your bank,
hmm
or maybe even sent money to a friend using some kind of app on your phone. And it all feels, I mean, it feels pretty simple,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like it
Right.
just
Right.
kind of works. But behind all those like, day-to-day transactions, there's this whole world of different payment systems that are kind of making it all happen behind the scenes.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And, I think a lot of us use these systems every single day, and we don't really give much thought to how that money is actually moving around or all the different players that are actually involved in making these transactions happen.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're going to like pull back the curtain on today. This whole deep dive that we're doing is really all about kind of understanding the ins and outs of all those payment methods that we use all the time. We're talking debit cards, credit cards, ACH transfers for things like paying your bills.
Yeah.
Even those like super fast real-time payments that seem to be getting more and more popular. And even this kind of like really interesting concept of a card with multiple balances on it.
Yeah, and what's really key for, for you as the listener is to understand not just the mechanics of how all of this stuff works, but also like the economics of it, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to dive into like how each of the players in these transactions actually makes money. So you can think of this as your kind of like insider's look at the financial engine that's powering our daily lives.
Yeah, totally. And our source material that we're working with for this is truly insightful. It's a really great exploration of just the world of payments and like just all the stuff that happens after you tap your card or swipe it or click that button to send that money. It's fascinating. But okay, so I think let's just jump right in. I think the best place to start would be with those kind of foundational card-based payments. And let's just start with those debit cards that everybody has.
Sure. Yeah. I think, a good way to kind of illustrate this is to imagine like a specific scenario. So let's say you're Emmett, right? And you're grabbing your usual morning coffee at let's say Bucks a Star Coffee, and you reach for your your MasterCard debit card issued by, let's say, Money Bin Bank, and you just tap it to pay. Seems pretty simple on the surface, but there's this whole chain of events that's just kicked off.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And so you've got Emmett there. He's the cardholder, and you've got Bucks a Star Coffee. They're the merchant, and that payment terminal that they're using. Yeah, that could be provided by a company like Square. They act as like a payment facilitator.
Right.
And they connect to a larger network through what's called an acquirer processor, like maybe Chase Payment Tech. And then, of course, you've got your bank, Money Bin Bank. They issued the card. And then MasterCard is, the card network that kind of sets all the rules of the road for all these transactions.
Right, exactly.
So it's like a whole lineup for a simple coffee purchase.
Yeah, and what's really interesting to think about is like that invisible dance of information that's happening in those 2 seconds while Emmett's tapping his card. So that terminal is talking to Square. Square is sending a request through Chase Payment Tech over to MasterCard. MasterCard is routing that request to Money Bin Bank to check, hey, does Emmett actually have the funds for this? And if everything looks good, Money Bin Bank sends an approval back through all those same channels. And that finally, tells the terminal at Bucks a Star Coffee, like, hey, you're good to go, complete this transaction.
So that's interesting, though, because the coffee's already, like, in Emmett's hand. But the money hasn't actually left his account yet. Like, what's going on there? I know there's terms like clearing and settlement.
Yeah.
Where do those come in?
Yeah, so that initial authorization that we just talked about is basically like a reservation of the funds. Like, we're pretty sure this money is good. It's just on hold for now. And then later, typically within a day or so, that transaction actually goes through a process called clearing. And this is where Bucks a Star Coffee is confirming, like, okay, here are the details of the purchase. Maybe Emmett added a tip or something. And then, following that is what we call settlement, which is where the money actually moves from Emmett's account at Money Bin Bank over to Bucks a Star Coffee's bank account, which is probably at a different bank, whatever bank they work with for their acquirer.
Okay, so now, I mean, I think this is what we all want to know. Like, how do all these different players in this whole, like, web, how do they get their piece of that $5.75? Like, where does the money go from that coffee?
Yeah, that's the real question, right? So when that transaction finally settles, MasterCard doesn't just pass the whole $5.75 on to Bucks a Star Coffee. They take a small percentage. It's called a network assessment fee. And they also collect another percentage called the interchange fee. And that one gets passed on to the issuing bank, Money Bin Bank.
Okay, so So in our coffee example, let's just keep it simple. Let's say both of those fees are around 1%.
Okay.
So that would mean like 6 cents going to MasterCard, 6 cents going to Money Bin Bank, just from that single $5.75 purchase. And I think, importantly, this is a cost that ultimately is borne by the merchant, by Bucks a Star Coffee.
Right, exactly. And, merchants, they accept these fees as kind of a cost of doing business, right? Being able to accept card payments. It makes it so convenient for customers like Emmett to be able to just tap their card and go. And, it's important to remember that these fees aren't just pulled out of thin air. They're based on these kind of complicated rate schedules that are set by the card networks. And those schedules take into account a bunch of factors, like the type of card being used. So like a basic debit card might have lower fees than like a fancy rewards credit card, or the merchants industry. So like a grocery store might have different rates than like a high-end retailer or something like that. And even how the transaction was processed. So like tapping or inserting the chip versus swiping, all those things factor into the fees. And then issuers can also have some other ways to make money, like monthly account fees or fees for specific services they offer to cardholders.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So you've got the card networks and the issuing banks taking their, small cut of each of these transactions. But what about the companies that are like actually providing those payment terminals and all the like processing power behind it? Like those Squares and Chase Payment Techs of the world, how do they make money?
Yeah, so those merchant acquirers like Chase Payment Tech, they charge merchants, what's called an acquirer fee for their role in enabling these card payments.
Okay.
And this fee can be structured in different ways. Sometimes it's like a flat fee every time a transaction happens. Sometimes it's a percentage of the amount. Sometimes it's a combination of both. But essentially, they're providing all the technical infrastructure, all the connections that Bucks a Star Coffee needs to plug into this card payment ecosystem.
Okay, and then we have these payment facilitators, or as we call them, PayFacs, like Square.
Mm-hmm.
They seem to have kind of a different business model going on.
Yeah, so PayFacs are basically bringing together like a ton of smaller merchants. So like our donut shop example, Dad's Donuts. Instead of each individual donut shop having to like set up their own agreement with an acquirer, they all operate under Square's kind of overarching merchant account. And Square often uses a simpler fixed pricing model. So like in our source material, it mentioned 2.6% plus 10 cents per transaction.
Okay, so if Dad's Donuts is using Square, they're paying that fixed percentage on every single sale. How does Square actually make money? Like, what's their profit margin?
Yeah, so Square's margin comes from the difference between that fixed price that they're charging Dad's Donuts and the underlying network assessment and interchange fees that Square itself has to pay out to the card networks and the issuing banks. And because Square is processing such a huge volume of transactions across all of their merchants, they can often negotiate better rates with acquirers than, one little donut shop could on its own.
Okay, so for a small business that's just starting out, like maybe Mufasa's Mobile Donut Emporium, using a PayFac like Square has some real advantages.
Yeah.
Like a quicker setup, and Square's kind of taking care of a lot of the complicated stuff around fraud monitoring and making sure everything's compliant with the rules.
Yeah.
But as a business grows and they're doing more transactions, it might make sense to, go directly to a merchant acquirer and have that direct relationship.
Exactly. Yeah. So having that direct merchant account often allows for like more customized pricing structure. So like there's something called interchange plus pricing, where the merchant is basically paying the actual interchange and network fees, those like pass-through costs that we talked about. And then on top of that, they're paying a smaller, more transparent fee to the acquirer. So that can often work out to lower overall processing costs for businesses that have, higher sales volume.
Okay, so we've really kind of dug into this world of these card-based payments and all the different players and how they make money. But now I think let's shift gears and talk about a totally different type of payment system, ACH. And that stands for Automated Clearinghouse. And I think most people probably encounter this when they're like setting up direct deposit for their paycheck or when they're paying bills online.
Yeah, ACH is definitely a different animal. It's a system that's designed for bank-to-bank transfers, using those account and routing numbers that we're all familiar with. And it handles like a truly mind-boggling amount of payments here in the U.S. I mean, our source material said that over 82% of all electronic payments go through the ACH network. So it's kind of the workhorse of the payment world for a lot of these recurring payments, like getting your paycheck deposit deposited, or setting up those automatic payments for, I don't know, your electric bill with PG&E, just like Emmett did.
Okay, so walk me through that. Like, how does that actually work? Emmett goes on to PG&E's website. He enters his bank account and routing number from Money Bin Bank. He authorizes them to, automatically take out the funds every month. Like, what's happening behind the scenes to make all that work?
So PG&E, through their bank, which is called the Originating Depository Financial Institution, or ODFI, they create this electronic record with all of the payment information in a standardized format called NACH. And this file gets securely transmitted to the Federal Reserve. They act as like a central clearinghouse for all these ACH transactions.
Okay.
And then the Federal Reserve sorts all these transactions, figures out which ones need to go where, and they forward the ones that are for Money Bin Bank, Emmett's bank, which is known as the Receiving Depository Financial Institution, or RDFI. And then finally, Money Bin Bank debits Emmett's account, credits PG&E's account, and that's how the money moves.
So it sounds like a much less, immediate process compared to swiping a card.
It is, yeah. ACH is typically a batch-oriented process, meaning that the transactions are grouped together and processed at these scheduled intervals throughout the day. So settlement often takes a day or two. And while ACH is generally a lot cheaper for merchants than, card payments, it does have the risk of insufficient funds. So, if Emmett didn't actually have enough money in his account, the payment could bounce, and that could lead to fees for both Emmett and PG&E. Whereas with the card payment, the transaction would usually just get declined right then and there.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. So then how do all those peer-to-peer payment apps like Venmo, how do they fit into this whole ACH picture? Because it feels like when you send money to a friend, it's instant.
Right. So Venmo actually relies pretty heavily on the ACH network for that actual movement of funds in the background. So when Emmett sends money to his friend Randy, let's say, through Venmo, even if Emmett doesn't have enough money in his Venmo balance, Venmo can initiate an ACH debit from Emmett's linked bank account. And they use, services like Plaid to connect to your bank account securely, so it feels really smooth. You don't have to manually type in your routing number and account number every time. And the kind of instant feel that Venmo gives you, it often comes from them essentially fronting the money or extending a little bit of credit while that underlying ACH transfer is actually clearing, which could take a day or two.
Oh, that's really interesting. So they're using the lower cost of ACH, but then they're creating this more immediate experience for the user.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so then what happens when speed is absolutely paramount, right? It has to be as close to instant as possible. That's where these real-time payments, RTP, and services like Zelle come in.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So real-time payments, RTP, is a newer system developed by the clearinghouse. And like the name suggests, it's really all about enabling those immediate payments directly between bank accounts. So, when you make a payment, it's irrevocable. That money is gone. And the cost for banks to access the RTP network is capped at a pretty low 45/100ths of a cent, so $0.045 per transfer.
Wow.
Although, banks might add their own service fees on top of that. But the idea is to create a much faster and potentially cheaper alternative to traditional wire transfers, especially for, smaller everyday transactions.
Got it. Okay, and then you've got Zelle. That's a network that was set up by a bunch of major banks working together, right?
Yeah, so Zelle is basically a network that was created by a consortium of banks. Initially, it was JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America. And Zelle basically allows for these near instant transfers directly between people's bank accounts. So you can almost think of it like a digital handshake between those banks. If Emmett and Randy both banked at Money Bin Bank, a transfer between them would essentially just be an immediate ledger update within that same bank. And Zelle basically extends that capability across different banks within their network. So there's really no settlement delay to speak of. The funds are usually available in the recipient's account within, seconds or minutes.
Oh, wow. That's incredible. Okay, so RTP and Zelle, they're all about that speed, moving money between bank accounts. But what if you need to get funds onto a debit card, super quickly? I know that our source material talks about this push-to-card technology.
Yeah, so push-to-card technology uses networks like Visa Direct and MasterCard Send.
Right.
And it essentially allows for very fast transfers of funds directly to a debit card. And the example in the book, the example with Khalil, I think really illustrates this perfectly. So when his car broke down, he was able to get his earned wages almost instantly on his, his Visa debit card through the branch app.
It kind of sounds like like if you return something to a store and they immediately refund it back to your debit card, it's almost like that, right?
Yeah, that's a really good analogy. It's essentially using the existing card network, but in reverse, to credit the debit card almost instantly.
Yeah.
And this technology is, it's becoming more and more popular for things like, instant payouts to people working in the gig economy, like Lyft drivers who want to be able to access their earnings right away after they finish a ride.
Yeah.
And there are also companies like Taba Pay that specialize in like optimizing how those push and pull transactions get routed to try and minimize the underlying interchange costs for businesses that are, that are using this technology.
So this is all really fascinating to me because we're seeing like all these different ways that money can actually move around.
Yeah.
So then the last payment system that our source material kind of digs into is this ESP cards, multiple balances on one card system. And this is a pretty new thing, right? This sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely a more recent innovation, and it really showcases just how flexible and programmable these modern payment systems can be.
Okay.
So the book describes an early example of this where Dave was demonstrating a Marqeta-powered blue debit card, and this card could be loaded with a specific value that could only be redeemed at a specific merchant.
Oh, wow.
So, like, let's say it was only redeemable at Farley's, right? And it might even include, like, a bonus offer from Farley's or something like that.
So instead of just having like one balance on your card that's connected to your primary bank account,
Right.
this type of card could actually have like these different virtual wallets or purses
It's exactly
of value on it.
Exactly, yeah. And each one would have its own kind of rules and restrictions on where and how it could be used.
So that's wild. So then how did this go from being like a cool feature to like a whole platform? Like how did that happen?
So what started as, as this kind of neat feature, it really evolved into a very powerful platform because companies realized that they could use this underlying technology to create their own custom card programs with very specific controls. And the example of Donut Dash in the book, I think, is a great illustration of this.
Okay.
So they could issue these cards to their delivery drivers with like a preset spending limit. And that spending limit would only work at certain like approved donut pickup locations. And that essentially prevents any like unauthorized purchases.
Oh, wow. That's really clever. And so how do the different entities that are involved in this multiple balances system, how do they make money?
So the card issuer, often working through a program manager like Marqeta, they earn interchange revenue each time that card gets used at an approved merchant, just like with a regular debit card transaction. But the real innovation here is that added layer of control and the ability for businesses to basically design really specific payment experiences for their customers or their employees, whoever they're issuing those cards to.
Well, so we've really taken a journey through like the complex and fascinating world of payment systems here.
Yeah.
And from that familiar swipe of a debit card to these like, almost instantaneous transfers using things like Zelle to these wild like multi-balance cards. It's kind of mind-blowing to think about all the complexity that's happening underneath those like really basic day-to-day financial interactions we have.
Yeah, and I think the key takeaway for the listener is really to appreciate that, something as seemingly simple as paying for something, it involves this whole diverse array of payment systems, and each one has its own mechanics, its own set of players, and, most importantly, its own way of generating revenue for the companies and organizations that are involved.
Yeah, it definitely makes you kind of look at those everyday financial interactions in a totally new light.
Right.
So the next time that you're, tapping your phone to pay, or paying a bill online, or sending some money to a friend, just take a minute to think about how many different organizations are actually involved in that seemingly simple action. And, how is each of those players creating and capturing value in that process? It's pretty remarkable when you think about it.
It really is. And I think it's also worth considering, which payment methods might actually be most advantageous for you in different situations, both for you and for the businesses that you're interacting with. I mean, because understanding these underlying systems really opens up a whole new perspective on efficiency and cost effectiveness in this like increasingly digital world that we live in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hey, this has been a great deep dive into the world of payments. I really appreciate you walking us through all of this.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and to all of you listening out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep learning and exploring.